In coming weeks, he'll be retiring from the Air Force after 40 years of dedicated service to our nation. General, you are a skilled and valuable advocate for the Air Force. We owe you and your family a debt of gratitude, and Godspeed to you. And part of your family, your better part, is here, Betty Welsh. And may I say thank you, Betty, for an Air Force life, your dedication to the airmen, both here and abroad, the extraordinary things you've done. May I add for the committee's information, you have 4 children, one of whom's a Marine. So the service continues, and we're awfully proud of you both. Thank you. General Welsh, you caught our attention with your remarks before the recent Air Warfare Symposium. You addressed the possibility of the Air Force being called upon to fight a major theater war in Eastern Europe or Asia against a well-trained and well-equipped army. I assume you were referring to perhaps the Russians or Chinese. You said, and I quote, "We're not really ready for that. It's going to be ugly," end of quotations. An assessment like that from someone of your experience should be of concern to our committee and to the nation. But the facts are the facts. We have the oldest Air Force aircraft in history and the smallest Air Force in years. At the same time, the Chinese Air Force, the 3rd largest Air Force in the world, is rapidly closing the gap with ours across a broad spectrum of capabilities: quality of their aircraft, command and control, radar, electronic warfare, and data links. China also possesses one of the largest forces of advanced long-range surface-to-air missiles in the world and some pretty sophisticated space architecture. Russia is procuring some new flanker fighters and developing a 5th-generation PAC FA fighter. The Kremlin also plans to build 56 long-range advanced S-400 surface-to-air missile battalions. They put down their markers for a lot of firepower, both in Syria and Iran, and deployed air forces to protect it. Elsewhere, Iran and other nations are working to buy additional advanced air defense missile systems from Russia. And while you are focusing on these rising threats in our committee, our Air Force and those of coalition nations are actively engaged with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East and the Taliban and ISIS in Afghanistan. While paying tribute to the bravery and skill of our aviators, some suggest that air power alone will not destroy these forces or even bring them to their knees, that boots on the ground will only assure that. Of course, we need to keep all of these challenges in mind as we go through this year's budget process, and the committee is anxious to hear your perspective on how the Air Force will maintain its aging fleet of bombers and fighters amidst growing demand for their services and the readiness of those who operate them. And may I add, their youth relative to the age of the aircraft. And I'm sure members will have questions about JSTARS, the Russian rocket engines, the A-10, and the nuclear enterprise, and your continuing needs for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. But a major issue hovering over the Air Force and the entire Defense Department these days is the looming bow wave of major acquisition programs. And I'm sure you'll address a lot of those issues in your testimony. We also saw the headline recently which read, "The coming dogfight between the F-35 and the new bomber." These are the 2 most sophisticated and expensive planes ever, and we need to hear how the Air Force proposes to fund both. In closing, Secretary James, General Welsh, the committee hopes it will convey to your airmen, officers enlisted, wherever they are, at home and abroad, our deep gratitude for their remarkable service each and every day. Pleased to yield to Mr. Viskovsky for any remarks he may wish to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing, General Secretary. Thank you very much for being here. Look forward to your testimony. Mrs. Wells, I join the chairman in welcoming you. If there are any difficult questions here in the committee, obviously we will direct them to you. Welcome. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary James, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Viskovsky, and to all of the members of the committee. It really is a pleasure for General Welsh and I to be able to come back and represent before all of you today the nearly 660,000 active duty National Guard reserve, and civilian airmen and their families, and we very much welcome the opportunity to do so. When we testified before all of you last year, we talked about our 3 priorities, and those 3 priorities are taking care of people, striking the right balance between our readiness needs of today and the modernization that we need for tomorrow, and making every dollar count, being the most efficient Air Force with the taxpayer dollar that we can possibly be. Well, I'm here to tell you that those 3 priorities have not changed, but what has changed over the last year or 2 or 3 is some of the world's conditions, and you touched upon much of this, Mr. Chairman, and if you'll permit me just a foot stomp, a few points. As we sit here today, your Air Force is working hard to degrade and ultimately destroy Daesh in the Middle East. And of course, we're not doing it alone. We're doing it as part of a whole of government, a whole of military, and a coalition approach. Last year alone, coalition forces upped the ante against Daesh, flying more than 55,000 sorties in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, which represents a 3-fold increase over the year 2014. And make no mistake, our United States Air Force shouldered the lion's share of that effort. Moreover, there's a resurgent Russia. It continues to foment problems in the Ukraine. They've become involved in Syria, and of course they have recently announced plans to modernize their nuclear weapons. In addition, we very recently observed North Korea conduct an illegal nuclear test and a rocket launch within just the last few weeks. We continue to see worrisome activity in the South China Sea by Chinese military forces, and of course we have very serious growing threats in space and cyberspace. And the bottom line to all of this is that the Air Force is key in each of these areas, each of these roles, and we are fully engaged in every region, in every mission area across the full spectrum of military operations. The way I would put it is we have never been busier as an Air Force, certainly not in the 35 years that I have been an observer on the scene here in Washington. So to confront these challenges, to continue confronting these challenges, and in order to maintain a fighting effective force, we bring before you a budget which tries to do our best to balance capacity, capability, and readiness. It also invests in future modernization, though this is where we made some of the tough choices this year, given that the budget agreement for FY17, for all of its good, did not provide the full amount that we need for our Air Force. And as a result, we couldn't bring before you as robust of a modernization portfolio as we would have liked. So let me now detail a few of the highlights of our budget choices as I go through these 3 top priorities, beginning with taking care of people. Our airmen and their families are our most important resource, and our budget reflects this truth. With that said, you already mentioned we're the smallest that we've ever been. We have been downsizing for years, and we know that enough is enough, and we cannot go any lower. The downsizing must stop, and indeed it has. We are now in a period of modest upsizing, and we're doing that in a total force way. And the top priorities include the areas of intelligence, ISR, cyber, maintenance, and our battlefield airmen. And we want to thank this committee for supporting the most recent active duty plus up from roughly 311,000 to 317,000 by the end of this fiscal year. You also supported our recent plus ups to the National Guard and Reserve, and we thank you for that, and to underscore, we simply cannot go any lower. And in reality, in our opinion, we believe that mission demands in FY17 are going to require us to likely grow more in FY17. And so to meet these demands, I plan to take a judicious approach to incrementally increase our total force beyond the current levels, provided, of course, that we can attract the right talent. And so we would be grateful when the time comes for this committee's assistance should a reprogramming action be required to help fund those additional people should we get that talent. Now, speaking of total force, we're continuing to maximize our use of the Guard and Reserve by shifting additional missions and workload when it makes sense to do so, such as in the fields of cyber and ISR, command and control, mobility, and space. And we are continuing to push the envelope big time when it comes to integration of our Guard and Reserve. And that goes from the staff level at the highest headquarters to the wing level, all levels of integration we are interested in. Moving on to other personnel concerns, we would ask for your support to provide requested funding for a 1.6% pay raise for both our military and civilians, as well as targeted pay and retention bonuses for a variety of career fields, including our very important RPA force. By the way, the RPA and manned pilot incentives are now equalized, and that's great news, but we shouldn't stop there. Specifically, we are submitting a legislative proposal this year which is intended to go farther to retain our aviators against what we see as an improving economy and increasing demand for commercial pilots. And finally, still on the subject of people, we're expanding our budget for the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program this year. We're fully funding our child care operations, boosting educational benefits, and we're making every effort to fund the most important infrastructure projects that are of benefit to our airmen. Now, moving on to the readiness and modernization equation, because we really need both. As you just said, and as we've tried to explain repeatedly, less than half of our combat air forces today are sufficiently ready for a high-end fight. Now, when I say a high-end fight, I mean a conflict that might take place in an anti-access aerial denial environment. An environment, plainly put, where the adversary can shoot us down or can interfere with us in some substantial way in space or air or cyber. So, moreover, in addition to that, today's aircraft inventory is the oldest it's ever been, and our adversaries are closing the technological gap on us quickly, which tells me we've got to modernize. We need to both be ready and we need to modernize. Now, in terms of readiness, we'll be funding flying hours to their maximum executable level. We'll invest in weapons system sustainment and ensure combat exercises like the red flag and the green flag remain strong. Now, after consulting with the combatant commanders, General Welsh and I agreed that we're going to make some needed adjustments to address some of the world changes that I mentioned earlier. For example, we are now proposing to rephase the retirement of the A-10 and the Compass Call aircraft. And the bottom line here is we are not proposing to retire any of these aircraft in FY17. We do believe that we will need to divest these weapon systems in the future, but this change of this year will maintain sufficient number of fighter and electronic attack aircraft across the force in support of current operations. And then the rephase that I mentioned will allow us to better align retirements of the older aircraft as we phase in the newer F-35. Furthermore, we're going to continue to examine this plan on a year-by-year basis and modify, if necessary, according to the global security situation. Now, in conjunction with ensuring the right number and mix of the manned aircraft, we also need the right number of remotely piloted aircraft and the very important munitions. No secret that ISR is the #1 combatant commander desire for additional Air Force capability. And to that end, thank you, especially to this committee for the $500 million in the department-wide funding that we received last year to fund increased ISR capability. Believe me, we are working big time with OSD to get as much of that for the Air Force and the ISR capabilities that we provide as we possibly can for things like the government-owned contractor-operated MQ-9 lines and the RQ-170 and ISR communications architecture, improved targeting analysis, and we would like some additional money for man days for our National Guardsmen who we're bringing on to help us in the ISR world. So these are all the areas that we're hoping to receive funding for, and we thank you for that funding. Additionally, we've got 24 MQ-9 Reapers in the budget and more money for JDAMs and small diameter bombs, which are the key munitions being used in the war effort. Turning to modernization, we have ongoing investments in our top priorities of nuclear deterrence, space, cyberspace. We're continuing to advance on the F-35, the KC-46, the combat rescue helicopter, and the TX programs. That's our next generation trainer. And we're going to start the JSTARS recap as well. We'll also continue to move forward with the B-21, the aircraft formerly known as the Long-Range Strike Bomber. And GAO's recent decision, I think, highlighted that we did follow a deliberate, disciplined, and impartial process to determine the best value for the warfighter and the taxpayer. But most important of all, what I want everybody to understand about the B-21 is that we really, really need this capability for our country. It will be the future linchpin of our bomber force. It will be enormously helpful in that anti-access aerial denial type of an environment that we view in the future, and it will be important for both conventional and nuclear purposes. Now, all that's modernization, but this is where we had to make some tough choices. So we had to defer some F-35s. We had to defer the purchase of some C-130Js. We have to delay upgrades to improve some of our 4th generation capabilities. And of course, many needed infrastructure projects for our basing structure are simply going to have to wait. And we would renew our call once again for your help in authorizing a BRAC in FY19. Few points on space launch. Point 1, I want to affirm to all of you that we are moving as quickly as we can to eliminate use of the RD-180 engine. The target, as you know, is 2019. This is ambitious, but we're doing it, and we're working it hard. Point 2, we're moving toward a domestic solution for rocket propulsion systems using full and open competition, which is exactly what the law asked us to do, and just as we did with the B-21. We've now obligated all $220 million of the dollars that Congress appropriated in 15 for this purpose. And point number 3, and finally, we do need reasonable flexibility to access RD-180s over the next few years until such time as the new engine is developed. That's important, but also integrated into a system and certified. So we need to develop it, we need to integrate it, and we need to certify it. And having this a little bit more flexibility with a few more RD-180s, we think is important to maintain the competition that we have all wanted for years. A total of 18 is our request. The last priority is make every dollar count. This is the efficiencies, and we've got a number of things going on here, including streamlined energy usage. We're implementing ideas from our airmen, and we're continuing the march toward auditability. As I wrap, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for your leadership and the others on the committee for the Bipartisan Budget Act. Much needed stability, predictability, and we're grateful for that. While we're appreciative, however, we do worry about the return of sequestration in FY18. We ask you, please, do your very best to get that lifted permanently, because if we were to return to sequestration, remember, we parked jets, we furloughed people, we took all sorts of actions that delayed our return to full spectrum readiness. So again, thank you so much for your support of our Air Force, and we look forward to your
Thank you,
questions.
Madam Secretary. General Welsh, front and center.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Visklosky, and a special thank you for recognizing my wife. Betty is magic, and the fact that you took the time to acknowledge her presence here today, I just can't thank you enough, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Members of the committee, it's always an honor to be here with you, and it's a privilege to be here with Secretary James representing our remarkable airmen. I would like to briefly address just 2 issues that are pressing on the Air Force today. First, the health of the remotely piloted aircraft enterprise, which we get a lot of questions about, including some from members of this committee, and second, pilot retention. First, the RPA enterprise. We are laser focused on improving the quality of life and establishing a manageable, long-term, livable battle rhythm for our remotely piloted aircraft community. The explosion in people, platforms, and resources that constitute this community, the medium altitude ISR community since 2001, has been stunning. And so has the volume and the quality of the work they've done in the battlefield. Because the mission area grew so rapidly, we have never gotten ahead of the training curve. And each year, recently, more pilots were leaving the remotely piloted aircraft force than we were able to train to go into it. Not good math for us. The Secretary of Defense helped us this last year by freezing the global requirement for RPA caps for the Air Force at 60, which is 5 below the 65 we were operating with 55 caps worth of people, which meant our people were in a surge mode nonstop. This allowed us to fully man our training units for the first time ever and to build our RPA pilot training pipeline to where it needs to be. By the end of FY17, we will be training 384 pilots a year in the RPAs. That's 200 more than we've ever produced in a year in the past. This is the first and the most significant step in the overall RPA Get Well plan, intended to improve quality of life for our RPA airmen and their families. That plan also includes incentive pay increases and bonuses for crews, standardized organizational constructs and crew ratios designed to allow sanity back into their schedule, and greater Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve operational mission activity to relieve some of the pressure on the active duty force. Air Combat Command also initiated an internal grassroots review that made over 140 recommendations that we are now working to close. As part of that effort, we intend to bed down an RPA operations group with the ability to execute missions around the world at a new CONUS location on an existing installation approximately a year from now, and then a full RPA wing at another location approximately 2 years from now. Both will provide additional assignment options for a force that has been very limited in their choice of locations up till now. Essentially, most of our RPA pilots went from Creech Air Force Base to Holloman Air Force Base to somewhere overseas. That was their entire career track up till this point. In the future, we're also planning to place RPA units overseas in both Europe and the Pacific. For years now, our RPA teams have been planning and executing life-saving and life-taking missions, but until now, there's been absolutely no normal in their lifestyle. They deserve the same care, feeding, and professional development stemming from careers guided by a normalized roadmap, and that's where we're headed. Air Combat Command's hard work on this Get Well plan is intended to light the way for us. No airman joins the service to get wealthy, but the unmanned aviation bonuses and incentive payments that you have appropriated do help us with recruitment and retention, and I just wanted to thank you for your support in that effort. But on their own, they aren't enough. If we don't fix quality of life for our RPA operators and their families, they won't stay in the Air Force. So we are committed to fixing this. The second issue is pilot retention, because the long-awaited pilot retention problem is here. In calendar year 15, major airlines hired about 3,500 pilots, and they expect to keep hiring at a commensurate rate for the next 9 to 10 years. Military pilots are in the perfect position to fill those jobs. They're highly trained, they're experienced, and thus they're very attractive to the airlines. Each year, we hope to retain about 65% of the pilots who are eligible to separate from the Air Force. One of the major tools we use in that retention effort is our aviation retention pay that you appropriate for us. The take rate in 2015 was just 55%, so 10% below the average. Proficient Air Force pilots can potentially transition from being a company-grade officer in the Air Force to being a commercial captain in a few short years with an airline salary that's roughly 2 times higher than military pay with someone of equivalent experience. And while we can't reasonably expect to stop the outflow, we are doing everything in our power to mitigate it and to convince those pilots who are on the fence to stay with us and those who are leaving to go into the Guard and Reserve. We're increasing pilot production to maximum schoolhouse capacity. We're revisiting the operational demand signal for pilots in non-flying jobs. We're partnering with RAND Corporation to fully assess the net effects of this hiring surge by the airlines, and we intend to seek legislation to increase all aviation retention pay for manned and unmanned platform pilots to $35,000 per year. And we will ensure that you have all the details you need to assess that proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, my personal thanks to each of you for routinely dedicating your time and attention to our Air Force and to those proud Americans who give it life. The Secretary and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. We have a lot of chairs and ranking members sitting at the table here today, and there's a keen interest in asking questions. Mr. Womack would like to have Chairman Cole have his opportunity to be here today. So in an unselfish act, I'm going to recognize you for the first question so you can go relieve him.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate my friend Mr. Carter for giving me the opportunity to do that so Mr. Cole can make it. First of all, to our witnesses here today, thanks. Thanks for everything you do. It's been a source of great personal pride for me to have a relationship with both of these two persons who have both visited my district, and I'm eternally grateful for what you represent, how you represent us, and what you represent in uniform. And I would just say this: I've had an opportunity, the unique opportunity, to be around our services in a very unique way, and I got to tell you, Mr. Chairman, as far as reserve component integration goes, nobody does it better than the Air Force, and that's a leadership-driven exercise, and I'm really grateful for that. I want to confine my questions to ISR. General Welsh, you just gave a pretty good synopsis of where we are in that capability, and Madam Secretary, you talked about it in your remarks. The Air Force FY17 request includes funding to sustain the MQ-1 and MQ-9 medium altitude permissive ISR capability with 60 remotely piloted aircraft combat lines to support combatant commander needs. So here's my question. Based on this surging demand that you've already articulated, we know that you're increasing RPA support unit capacity stateside. And do you expect the RPA enterprise to continue to grow into the out years? And what concerns does that do that present for our country and certainly for our Air Force? I'd also like to, I'm going to put a couple of questions on your plate here and then I'll yield. As demand for ISR has grown quickly, the capacity is yet to keep up, and understanding our budgetary constraints, when do you expect our capacity to catch up with demand? Now, that does require to have a bit of a crystal ball out there in terms of future conflicts, but I think you get the idea there. And with the ever-increasing need for more, coupled with units like the 188th in my district that support this growth, do you see the need for more stateside basing of similar units in the total force? So I've had some others, but I know I'll run out of time. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to those particular questions because they are going to be increasingly important to the fight.
So I would say, Congressman Womack, when it comes to the first part of your question in terms of do we foresee ISR growth, yes, we do. We have ISR growth already embedded in our budget now, and based on, as the chief referenced, the CPIP, that action that the Air Combat Commander took where he asked many of the airmen for their suggestions, it became very clear really to him and to all of us that we needed more growth. So I expect that there will be more growth that is coming out of the next POM that we do. So there's what you see before you in the 5-year plan, but by the time we lay out next year's 5-year defense plan, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see more growth. In terms of when will capacity catch up with demand, I don't want to sound flip, but I think the answer is probably never, because as we continue to grow, the demand just keeps going up, up, up. Now, we do have what we call our Get Well plan in order to have a proper quality of life, a proper pace of life, and the right number of airmen who are in sync with doing a certain number of caps. So that plan we will catch up within the next year, year and a half or so, if I'm not mistaken. But every time I speak to a combatant commander, they want more. And indeed, that has been our history. Every time we thought we knew what the requirement was, the requirement has gone up. And I furthermore think that more stateside basing is something that we absolutely should look at.
So I agree with the boss. I think the growth in the RPA community will be two different types, short-term and long-term. The short-term growth will be more demand for what we have today. We hear that routinely. The department has tried to stabilize a requirement at 90 caps. The Air Force will be responsible for 70 of those. 60 will be blue suit, 10 of them will be government-owned, contract operated, and they will do ISR only. They won't do anything else. And the others will come from the Army and from others, and other GOCO operations run by the department. So that's going to be the requirement going forward. Will it stay there? Probably not. I remember it was 21 caps in 2008, and it hadn't stayed there very well. The thing we have to think about, though, if it goes up dramatically, is it's more people, it's manpower. The biggest restriction we'll have won't be money or the ability to buy the platforms, it's finding the people and increasing our top line to afford 10 or 20 or 30,000 more people to do this enterprise. We've built this enterprise out of nothing over the last 10 years, 12 years, and it's now got 35 to 36,000 people in it. We did it at the same time we were drawing down the Air Force overall, 50,000 people. So to the rest of the service, it was an 85,000 person cut. So everything else is thinned out. We needed to build this enterprise, but if we keep building it, we're just taking muscle out of every other mission area to do it now. There's no place else to go, which is why we had to go to modernization this year in the budget. We couldn't take more people.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Womack. Ms. McCollum, and then Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's going to come as no surprise to my colleagues. I'm going to talk about the Arctic, as I have with many of our other service representatives and even in classified briefings. Chairman Calvert and I spent a lot of time working on interior issues, and we're hearing firsthand from many tribal nations that we're going to have to be looking at working with them for relocation for places to live. And so it made me curious about what was going on with some of our other federal assets in the Arctic region. So Secretary James and General Welsh, as you know, the Arctic is a resource-rich environment, feeling the full effects of climate change. Melting sea ice has opened navigable waters in the Arctic and has changed the strategic calculus in the region. With respect to the Air Force, I'm particularly concerned about the effects of climate change is having on our facilities in Alaska, A GAO report, the Department of Defense Infrastructure and Climate Change from May of 2014, states that the combination of thawing permafrost, decreasing sea ice, and rising sea levels on the Alaska coast have led to an increase in coastal erosion at several Air Force radar early warning communication installations. This erosion can damage roads, utilities, seawalls, runways, and in some cases, cutting these facilities off from all but small planes and helicopters. Due to the critical need for these early warning facilities in a changing threat environment, we must ensure that our infrastructure in Alaska is maintained. Are there Air Force facilities at risk? What is the Air Force doing to mitigate the impact of climate change on all your facilities?
So I'll start maybe, and Chief, you jump in as well. First of all, when it comes to the Arctic, I agree with you. It's very important, and we do of course, have a DoD strategy which feeds into the national strategy on the Arctic. And for the Air Force, of course, our focus in all of this is access in air and space, as well as early warning, being able to conduct ISR, and providing comms. In the near term, very focused on Air Force civil support to civil authorities and other agencies that are doing a wide range of activities. In terms of climate change, that's a big deal too. And recent QDRs have recognized climate change as an emerging threat and condition that we have to really pay attention to in our national security. And combatant commanders, of course, have to react and deal with emerging threats as they present. I do not have at my fingertips, but perhaps you do, the exact impacts in Alaska.
Ma'am, there are a couple of facilities that have been infected. We have one radar site, and I'm blank on the name. I apologize. I can get it for you. I'm just not thinking of it right now. Which has had a real problem with this because the ice that used to be along the coastline that protected the infrastructure along the shore from the waves that would crash in is gone. And so the waves are now hitting the shore, they're hitting the concrete abutments where the piering was. They're actually working at the foundation of some of the infrastructure that's along the coastline. Stuff that was never a problem before and is clearly a problem now. I believe the last number I saw was $50 to $60 million in estimated damages in a couple of places, total, in a couple of places in Alaska at these small sites that are along the coast. We can get you the specifics on this, ma'am, because there is an issue. It's a serious issue.
Mr. Chairman, as these facilities are facilities we looked at maybe doing general maintenance as a line item in previous budgets, we might have to be looking at moving them and the relocation costs associated with that. So I think as we move forward in our budget planning for facilities, and I'm going to have another question later on about some facilities that maybe should be closed down, we're going to have to look at cost savings, but also we're going to have to look at a security threat possibly in Alaska if we don't start moving forward on making sure that these facilities are secure. I saw some University of Alaska shots of what they predicted would happen to some of our Air Force assets in Alaska and the moves that might have to come because they don't see this climate change doing anything but moving forward, and Alaska is losing this ice shelf at a more rapid pace than they thought, exposing some of our facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCollum. Judge Carter and then Mr. Ruppersberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome both of our guests. I think you are both exceptional people, and it's an honor to work with you. General Welch, as you know, the Army, and I'm Fort Hood. I've got the Army all over me, is transitioning from 15 years of counterinsurgency to decisive action operations. How does this budget reflect the Air Force's role in supporting this strategic transition, ensuring we capitalize on the relationship built between the Air Force and the ground forces over the last 15 years? Can you speak to your service's current support of the ERI at combined training centers and the European training exercises?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to. A couple of things. Number one, worldwide, not just in Europe, we have been working very closely with the Army for a long time now. Remember, air-land battle actually started back in the mid-'80s. We have come a long, long way since that point in time, and we have airmen embedded with Army units all over the world now. They live with them, they train with them, they fight with them, and they die with them occasionally. This is something we cannot lose the lessons from, not just of the last 15 years, but the last 30 to 35. We are working this very, very hard. We have established a Battlefield Airman a program office, for example, to make sure those guys keep up with the technology that the rest of our Battlefield Airmen and the Special Ops community are using, and bring that to the relationship with the United States Army. We're re-energizing the effort to support the Army rotations at the National Training Center and at Fort Polk with our Green Flag exercises. We are in Europe, all the things that are going on with ERI. We have Air Force units that are rotating heel to toe, just as the Army and the Marine Corps have ground units rotating heel to toe. Air Force JTACs are training NATO JTACs side by side with Army maneuver units. We're committed to doing this together. Mark Milley and I are kind of bonded at the hip on this one. We can't lose this relationship.
You think it's better than the permanently stationed over there to have the heel-to-toe deployment? Is that a better plan?
Well,
I've asked the same thing of the Army.
I think it depends on how you look at it. So, the Army has done about what the Air Force has done, which since, 1980 or so, we've pulled 75% of our force structure out of Europe. Replacing it permanently back into Europe would be immensely expensive and would pose a set of challenges you might not get past. The next best thing is rotational presence, making sure we stay connected to our allies, making sure we are reassuring and assuring them, and making sure that we're training together in an environment that it's important to know how to fight in, just in case we ever had to.
Do I have still time?
Thank you, Judge Carter.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, all right. You want to get your oar on the water very quickly. Did you have another question?
No, it's all right.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rufusberger and then Ms. Granger.
I want to thank you both for your leadership. It takes leadership, and you're doing a great job. I want to get into we talked a lot in this committee about space costs, and not only in terms of launch costs, but also in their development. However, in the face of the resurgence in China and Russia, it's important to ensure that we're taking the necessary actions to protect our investments in space. Now, in recent years, both Russia and China have conducted tests of anti-satellite weaponry. In order to ensure the United States is able to continue to project power in space, I believe it is vital that we have visible deterrence to these capabilities of our near-peer competitors. I understand the nature of this question is sensitive, and perhaps these deterrents are not yet ready to be made public or are classified. However, please do your best to answer the following questions. First, do Russia and China currently have the capability to pose a credible threat to U.S. space assets? Second, is the Air Force investing in deterrent technologies to defeat their capabilities? And one other question I'd like you to ask in the end, and I'm repetitive when we do this, but I think that the sequestration law is probably one of the worst things that's happened to this country and to our national security. And I just want to make sure we ask the question you can address if we don't deal with this issue. Luckily, we have a 2-year hiatus. Thanks, and I think most of the members of this committee, especially my friends on the other side, understand how serious the sequestration law is to our national security. Thank you.
I would begin by saying I do think there are very credible threats to our space assets, and you know it, Congressman Ruppersberger. A lot of America doesn't realize how important space is to both military and the civilian way of life. But it's crucial, and there are credible threats out there. That's precisely why we're putting so much focus on it. We have shifted on the order of $5.5 billion toward, as you call it, sort of deterrent aspects, protecting our constellation, and we're also, very, very importantly, undergoing a culture change. When in the past, perhaps we looked at satellite operations as an operations aspect, now we're looking at it much more as a just as we look at other domains. We are doing wargaming, we're doing experimentation, we're actively thinking about if this happens, then how do we protect and fight the constellation? So that's a culture change for our airmen as well. And then sequestration, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a bad law. It will have impacts, if it goes through again, in every part of our Air Force, including space.
Thank you. Chairman?
Sir, our space assets are clearly at risk today. We are investing and planning for ways to mitigate that risk and become more resilient in that domain over time. And clearly, sequestration is a threat to national security unless we are planning on changing the national security posture of the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppersberger. Ms. Granger and then Mr. Ryan.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you for your service. It's exceptional, and we appreciate it very much. General Welch, on your retirement, I hope we get to see some of you in Texas. look forward to that. And Secretary James, thank you. The Army recently released their report on the National Commission on the Future of the Army, and that was similar to a product to the Air Force, which was released several years ago. As part of the report, a sizable drawdown of forces was announced. I know you mentioned this in your opening remarks, so go over it once more time, what a right-sized Air Force looks like in terms of military end strength, and how are you best incorporating the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve?
I'll begin by saying I think a right-sized Air Force has to be bigger than the Air Force of today, which is why we're building up minimally to that 317,000 number I referenced on our active duty side. But I'm prepared, if we can get the right talent in, to go beyond that. I have, under law, the Secretary of the Service has up to 2% authorization to exceed end strength in any given year. And so that's what I meant when I said, if we can get the right talent, I would use that authority, and we may have to come back and ask for your assistance at the appropriate time with the reprogramming. I think similarly, we could use some additional end strength in the reserve components, National Guard and Reserve, and once again, I would judiciously use that authority if we get the right talent into our force. I think, ultimately 321,000, particularly on the active duty side, is a number that we have validated. We've talked about it in the past, so I would use that as a target. But then we look at the ISR discussion that we just had and needing to build that up. Those numbers are not fully in the 321, so it may actually be higher than that. But my point is, the bottom line is we can't go any lower, and we have to continue the steady state of modestly building up to fill holes, important capabilities like ISR, and it must be on a total force basis. As we thank the gentleman, Mr. Womack, we like to think, we're big total force supporters, and we are.
Thank you. Yesterday, we had a hearing, and we talked about maternity leave for women in the military and having a situation where they're more likely to stay in and come back and not lose that asset. When you talk about the pilots and the training and how many you have to train and making sure you've got the right people, I know you're also looking at how to keep the right people, because that training and losing them to the airlines and training again is so incredibly costly. So do you see changes in the future, or are you looking at things that would keep them in longer?
We are constantly looking at retention incentives, retention approaches. Specifically, when we're talking about women, the chief and I rolled out a series of initiatives some time ago to either help recruit or retain, or in some cases develop, some of our fantastic women, minorities, and white males for that matter. We want better retention across the board. So the maternity leave is one aspect. There are other aspects as well, but you're quite right. When we lose highly trained, very capable people, it's not a good day for the Air Force, and so we want to keep them. And again, keeping them might mean keeping them in the Guard and Reserve. If they're on the team, they're on the team, but we want to retain.
General Welsh, do you have anything to add from your many years of service on retaining our talent?
Yes, ma'am. We've always retained enough talent to remain a great Air Force, and I think we will in the future. There are always going to be people whose time has come to separate. Their family needs more stability. They have a different career goal in mind in a different arena. Those people will serve honorably. They'll leave. We'll congratulate them and be very proud they stood beside us. There are other people who are going to stay in because they love the Air Force. They don't want to leave. They just want to keep doing what they're doing. And then there are some in the middle who are wavering one way or the other, who typically enjoy the job, enjoy the work they're doing, whether it's flying or anything else, but they're frustrated by something. It could be not enough hours at the Child Development Center. It could be not enough flying time. It could be any number of things. And what we've tried to focus on is identifying those things that would make a difference to the people who are on the fence and try and keep them in. For anybody who is leaving, we have tried very hard to get the information out to them so they can go to the Guard or Reserve. Because if we keep them in the Guard and Reserve, we keep them in the Air Force. It really is one Air Force when it comes right down to it, and they'll be fantastic supporting us in those components. And so the active duty force has to remain strong so the Guard and Reserve can remain strong. So that's where we tend to focus. What are the things that keep those people who are wavering and could go either way in the Air Force? And that's where incentive pay, bonuses and things do have an impact in that regard, but they're not going to convince everybody. But the ones we're after, they sometimes will keep with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Mr. Ryan, and then Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service. Appreciate you being here. One of the issues that we have to grapple with, too, is not just the military issues, but also some of the other threats that we are seeing that face our country and the world. Last year in the Appropriations report, we gave you some language for compliance with a directive to say that we need to prioritize recapitalization of the Air Force's 3 special mission aircraft, so the aerial spray, the airborne firefighter system, and the hurricane hunters. And we're seeing even more of this now with Zika, that the aerial spray unit, I think, can play a major part in helping us combat some of this. So can you tell us what your plan is to ensure that we can meet these challenges?
So the Air Mobility Command has got the lead to put together an integrated modernization plan for the entire C-130 fleet. And it includes everything from C-130J recapitalization to AMP increment 1 and 2 for all the C-130H models in all 3 components. That plan has been, the funding is in place to complete the modernization program for both increments. The detailed plan of which units rotate when is being developed right now, which ones will go to, on what timetable to do the increment 1 and 2 upgrades. And the other piece they're putting in this is a game plan for if we were able to get additional C-130Js, where would they go first? Because the only thing we have left on the buy on the active side is our Air Force Special Operations Command C-130Js, which come in over the next 4 years before they complete. After that, there is no money in the C-130J line, but we would clearly like to continue recapitalizing the C-130 fleet as we can. It wouldn't make sense to upgrade airplanes, Inc. 1 and then Inc. 2, and then buy a C-130J and replace the newly modernized airplane. So we're trying to build into that plan an option for recapitalizing specific units in the reserve component with the J model as kind of the first place we'd go. Your language from last year that came out in the NDA is part of the factor that AMC is considering in that detailed planning. I think within the next 2 months, the plan will be finalized. It'll be coordinated with TAGs and with the Air Force Reserve Wing commanders, and we'll be able to share it with everybody.
Right. Secretary, you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I really don't. I think the chief covered it.
Okay, great. The other piece, quickly, Mr. Chairman, because I know you're looking at me.
We always enjoy
I could
looking
feel
at
him.
you.
I could feel him right here.
And listening to you.
Just to mention America Makes, which is the Additive Manufacturing Institute in Youngstown, Ohio, that is doing a lot of work with the Air Force now. We're also partnering with the University of Dayton Research, and this is 3D printing parts well into, hopefully soon, but well into the future, that I think can save the Air Force lots and lots of money, military lots and lots of money, to be able to print some of these parts wherever you are. This is the future of manufacturing. This is the future of the military, and you're continuing to help drive this. So I want to bring that to your attention and say how great it is to watch this whole new industry and sector unfold. It's projected to grow about 25% a year for the next 10 years and can help us reduce costs here. So I want to thank you for your support for that, and hope we can continue to have your support on that. So thank you very much.
We're always proud of the Buckeye contribution, and I'm sure the Air Force has duly noted it. Mr. Crenshaw, and then Mr. Graves, who's very patient at the end there.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my words of thanks to both of you all for your service. I want to talk a little bit about the JSTAR program. It seems like every year the Air Force moves the goalpost, and I guess it creates a certain amount of consternation with this subcommittee. Like this year, you asked for half as much money, and then the program slipped another 2 years. And as I understand, this is a non-developmental program. You take an in-use airplane and you put an in-use sensor on it, and people say, why does that take 12 years? And I've talked, and I know other members of the subcommittee have talked to senior people at the DOD, talked to senior folks in your organization, and just to say what's going on, who's slowing this thing down, And industry indicates you could probably do this in half the time. That may or not be true, but we get different answers from the different folks we talk to. And I guess the question is, maybe since you all are going to make the final decision, we get to ask the right people what's going on. I mean, why is it taking so long? Is it being slowed down on purpose? It seems to me that there's a certain risk involved. If we don't have these replacement planes, that the commanders are not having an asset they need. So tell us what's going on. Why is it taking so long? And is there a chance you could speed it up or make it happen in a more reasonable amount of time? We need some kind of final answers, please.
So I would begin by saying the start date on this has changed over time for at least 2 or 3 reasons. So the two that really leap to mind, the Air Force slowed it down at one point because I think it was the judgment of our service acquisition executive and some others that the laydown of the strategy wasn't quite ready at that point, that it was too ambitious, that if we were going to do it, we wanted to do it right, and we needed a little bit more time to think it through. So that was one aspect. Another aspect is there has been a debate, which has now been settled, by the way, but there has been a debate within the Department of Defense with respect to, requirements, and could this capability be done by an unmanned platform, and is it really ISR, or is it battle management, or is it both? So there was a debate sort of surrounding requirements that we had to work through, which is now settled, as I said, which allows us to move forward. So I just want to say to you, we're very committed to the program. It's an important part of our future. We are going to get going with it. I would love to speed it up if at all possible, and we will be looking to see, can we do that? It's a little bit more challenging, though, than taking an existing platform and putting existing radars. It's a little bit more challenging than that because it requires the integration of these things together in new ways. So it's not quite that simple, but believe me, we do want to go as quickly as we can because it is an important program for us.
Well, do you have, so it slipped to you, this year you asked for half as much as we might have anticipated, and so it slips 2 more years. What are you saying? It's not going to slip anymore, or it's back on track, or what's the new timeline?
So right now, we're in what we call technology maturation and risk reduction. There's 3 different companies that are participating in this, and this is to buy down the risk associated with some of the radars. So the amount of money that we requested this year very much goes with that increment of the program. So you got to get that part done before you start spending money on the other increments of the program. So it is certainly my hope, and I'm going to be working as hard as I know how to work to keep it on track according to this schedule from here on out, with the caveat that these are development programs. Integration can be a challenging aspect, and you just don't know what you don't know. So it is development, and that's why I would caveat it.
You got a plan now. You've settled some of those issues, and there's a plan to get it done, right?
That's right.
Congressman, there is no bigger proponent for this program than me. It's in the budget. It's funded all the way through IOC. 2024 is the plan. We'd like to pull it back to 23 for IOC, which means we should be delivering airplanes into 21 or 22 at the latest. And we think we're past all the resistance. We think we're past the tech maturation problems. We think this year the reason for the lower amount was so the companies could actually do this work. It has to do with integrating a radar, which there were some problems with. And that's why I think our SAE made a wise choice to just take a deep breath for a year. Let's get this right, and then we'll kick the program off and go. But I think we're on track. Unless somebody else jumps up and tries to stop it, I think we now have a plan, it's funded, and we're ready to roll.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is an imperative, and you're going to be reporting, I think, to the committee in pretty short order as to where we stand. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Calvert, excuse me, Mr. Graves, I wanted to recognize Chairman Calvert, who actually was ahead of you. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary James, General Walsh, thank you for appearing before the committee, and certainly thank you for your dedicated service to our country. We certainly appreciate it. We are proud of our reservists and our National Guard units over at March Air Reserve Base in California. They're doing a fabulous job for our country, and we certainly appreciate their support. I'd like to talk a little bit about where we're going in launch. A number of us are concerned about space and our future in space, what our plan is to make sure we maintain our superiority, but we also got to get to space. And obviously, you know, we went down this track to create some competition for ULA with SpaceX, which has been successful, and some successful launches. We didn't anticipate, of course, that Russia would invade Crimea and occupy it, and provocative actions in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, where it makes it very difficult for us to justify acquiring RD-180 engines from Russia to power our Atlas V. And of course, the Delta is retiring. Now we've created another monopoly, maybe. So we need to get a replacement engine as quickly as possible. You were talking about that in your testimony. And I'm happy to see where the Air Force has worked together with ULA and Rocketdyne to start moving forward with the AR-1 replacement engine. And Rocketdyne seems to be pretty confident that they can get this engine up by 2019. But you mentioned that there may be a need to acquire RD-180 engines. But I don't think that Congress, certainly in the Senate, I don't see a lot of support for that. So what is your plan for launch in the next few years and before we can get a replacement engine? I think, you know, obviously Blue Origins and others are trying to create other ways for us to get to space, but we're going to have this gap here. We're going to put off the retirement of the Delta. Or how many reserve engines do you have on the RD-180? How long will that get us? So with that, I'll turn that over to the Secretary and the General.
You just gave a great summary, Mr. Calvert, of the complexity of space. Try to go back to basics as I try to think through all of these complexities. The basics are we have 3 mandates. We want assured access to space, and that's the one that we care most about. We want to get off the RD-180 as soon as possible, and we're shooting to have that development done by FY19. And we want competition. I think the conundrum is we're increasingly looking like we can't have all 3 of those because we're boxed in such a way that something's going to have to give. So it remains to be seen what. But let me, if I may, tell you our strategy. We buy an engine, and we don't buy a rocket. We buy launch as a service. That is why we are trying to invest in rocket propulsion systems that relate to launch as a service. And so, as I mentioned, we've just awarded in a full and open competition way monies that you all appropriated that provide different companies that have the capacity possibly to take us into space ways to help their rocket propulsion systems do that. And Aerojet is one of the companies, but there are others that also won some of these monies in the competition as well. The reason I said why flexibility in some additional, like 9 new RD-180s would give us what we think is reasonable flexibility, it allows us to compete. If we don't have more, there may not be a competition.
But isn't it true? I mean, I don't, it seems to be overwhelming opposition to that, especially in the Senate. One particular senator I have in mind, and it is just absolutely no. So if that occurs, what do we do in the meantime?
Then we may not have the competition aspect. That's why I say we have 3 mandates. We may have to give up on one. We may have to look for another mechanism to assure us the access to space.
Is SpaceX capable of meeting that challenge if, in fact, they're the only launch capability we have?
There are 8 types of launches, and right now, today, SpaceX is capable of doing 4 of the 8.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Well, would you put some numbers on what you're talking about here? This Monday, didn't you announce that you'll spend a certain amount this year and up to $530 million for Aerojet?
Yes. So.
And then you're making a similar investment with the Blue Origin.
That's correct.
So, maybe we can give the committee some perspective. We're talking about, I think, spending, to date, what is it, $750 million or something? It's some incredible amount.
Get close to $1 billion.
Yeah.
That's right.
Put some numbers, if you would, if you please. Thank you for yielding.
Would you like me to do it now, Mr. Chairman?
Please
or-
do, yeah, I think.
Okay, so what we've announced, $115 million for Aerojet Rocketdyne, which, assuming options are exercised, would go up to $536 million over the next few years. And then there's that's what it is for Aerojet. And I could go through each of the companies, but the main point I wanted to make is
capability. And I certainly have some concerns here in the short term on how we're going to meet our short-term requirements to get to space. And that's something we really need to
industry. It's ambitious, but that is our objective. That's what the law says, and that's what we are moving toward. But the development of the engine is not integrated on a rocket, and it is not certified. So there are other pieces to this that must also be accomplished. And to get all of that done, we certainly believe it's beyond 2019.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding.
thank you.
Okay, who do we have? Mr. Graves?
Good morning, Madam Secretary General. Thank you for being here. Following up on Mr. Crenshaw's questions as it relates to JSTARS, and first, let me just say thank you. I appreciate hearing that you'd love to speed up the program, and certainly your passion for the program as well. We have a passion also as a committee, and very broad support, bipartisan support in the Appropriations Committee, and then the Armed Services Committee as well in the House and in the Senate. And but each year we've been hearing this love and desire to speed up or accelerate, but for some reason things slip and slip and slip. Before you maybe share with us how we could accelerate, you know, knowing that you'd like to accelerate, what are the mechanisms or the ways or the processes in which we could help or that you expect could accelerate a program? Share with this committee the dangers if we don't, because my understanding, and maybe I'm misinformed, is that there's going to be a major capabilities gap that will occur, that we can continue pushing this off, but as we do that, the current aircraft that are being utilized today are beyond their service life or close. Half are in depot maintenance currently when they should be in the air, and many are going to be coming offline over the years, and I heard that 2023 being IOC, which means really not capable of being used for another few years, I would imagine, or maybe that is, but even if that was the first year of operation and in a theater somewhere, that's still 7 years from today, and there's still a gap that's expanding over and over. So knowing that, could you just describe to us what the dangers are if we don't accelerate, and then what are the ways that you see that we could accelerate and move forward a little bit quicker? Thank you.
Well, I would just begin by, you essentially did a great job of explaining the dangers. We could have a capability gap. The JSTARS of today are on average, I believe, 47 years old. They have a lot of downtime. There's a lot of maintenance issues, and yet they're very much needed by the combatant commanders. So the longer this takes, the more the risk that we would have that capability gap. Just a couple other data points on the current schedule. We do expect a milestone B for the fourth quarter of FY17. Chief already said the IOC is in FY24, but there's some possibility we could move that up a year or two. I don't believe more money this year would help, but let me go back and double check that. I do believe more money in the out years would allow us to speed up and possibly achieve that 1 or 2 year improvement that the chief talked about, but please allow me to go back and double check that dollar issue.
And as you mentioned the capabilities gap, and maybe General you could answer this, current number of aircraft today that are operational and the current number that would be operational when the first IOC is available in 2024.
So I'd have to go look at the schedule of when airplanes are scheduled to drop offline based on new depot requirements and degrading airplanes. I don't know that exact number right now at IOC.
The average year would be
54
years old.
But the first one's within a year of now.
Right.
So it's the problem is here.
Yes.
It's not in the future. And so the thing that has slowed this down the most over time has been this debate about what's the best way to meet this requirement. That's been the big slowdown. We're past that now. It was a fair conversation, I think. It had to happen. I'm hoping we're past that. The combatant commanders are still very clear in their requirement. The Joint Staff, the Joint Requirements Oversight Committee still supported the requirement, so we're moving. And we will sign an EMD contract Right now, the milestone is the first quarter of FY18. Once that contract is signed, I think we will have a better idea of the real timeline for the program, and we will very shortly after that have an idea of how much can you accelerate based on where the technology and the integration process stands then. How successful was our risk reduction and technology maturation effort over this year and the next year, and we'll know more by then. At that point, I think if we can accelerate, that's when we can throw more money at the problem and try and move it ahead faster. Until then, I think we're guessing. And I would hate to put a whole lot more money into the program at this point until we knew that we could actually use it the right way.
Okay.
I would hate to even ask you for that money at this particular point.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me note, I mean, it just gives me greater appreciation for our airmen and women to know that they are doing all they can with an average age of aircraft. You said 47 years old today, and it would be likely 4 years old when we finally get there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chairman, if I could just point out, that would be now be, at that point in time, our 7th fleet of aircraft that would be over 50 years old.
Thank you, Chairman.
So noted with alarm. Chairman Cole, thank you.
Well, we're not all alarmed because a lot of those get maintained at Tinker Air Force Base, Mr. Chairman. So we think we
I knew
do
you'd
that
land on the
pretty
right
well.
spot. Boom.
But just in case that was overlooked, but it actually does get to the question I wanted to ask, and I will be sort of shamelessly parochial here, but I'll try and include other depots as well. As you know, Madam Secretary, better than any of us around this table, about 70 or 80% of the cost of any weapon system is maintaining it over its projected lifestyle or cycle. And we all know that we're maintaining a lot of systems a lot longer than we ever intended them to be maintained. So we run into problems like my friend from Georgia referred to, where these things are very difficult, almost have to be individualized in how you overhaul each particular plane, because we're way beyond what anybody thought about how you would maintain them. So even getting parts sometimes is a huge problem. So how comfortable are you that you've got what you need in terms of both the 3 major depots that you have, and obviously we have a lot of private contractors involved in this kind of work, and are we directing enough money into those areas if indeed we're going to have to keep these planes flying longer than any of us would like to?
Well, first, if I could begin by saying I've, of course, been to our depots, very, very proud of the work that's going on, fantastic accomplishments for this very important area of sustainment. I would also tell you that we are continuing to invest in such things as tooling and the various types of equipment that are required in the depots for both our new systems like the F-35, the KC-46 that are coming on, but also for our existing systems, the existing aircraft, the nuclear mission, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're doing a pretty good job of investing in that sort of equipment. 2 concerns I would give you is that, and this is a concern across the board, I mentioned it in my opening statement, infrastructure. So keeping up the roads, keeping up the buildings. So for the depots, I'm worried about infrastructure, but you know what? I'm worried about that across the whole Air Force. So that's one thing. And then civilian hiring is another thing. So the depots are, of course, largely civilian employees, and when you combine the effects of sequestration a few years ago, and that set us behind in terms of the workload, the hiring, that got us all messed up. You've got OPM rules, which are a constraining factor for us, security clearances that are, long to come through. All of this is a concern. So I would say civilian hiring and infrastructure would be the 2 concerns.
On that point, on the hiring point and the workforce point, frankly, during sequestration, self-inflicted wound, we all agree was a mistake. But when we had government shutdowns, we also made a pretty big mistake because we were furloughing people that we paid through the working capital fund at places like Tinker that didn't need to be furloughed. And so a lot of that extra work was built up. So none of us ever want to be in that situation again. But if we are, I would vote, and I ask for a response on this, I would urge that you keep the workforces that you can working. Don't just send them home because some have to go home. Make sure, because it was a much more difficult problem getting up. Having lost their capacity, then we're in an overtime situation. It's more expensive at the other end. So when you can keep people working, and those workforces, again, because of the way in which they're paid, many of them can be kept there. I would hope we could do that if we're ever in this situation again.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a comment on that you'd care to make?
No, I think that
Would you like
all-
to make an assurance?
That all makes good sense to me.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just getting back to Congressman Calvert's about the RD 180, do we have the capacity? If we don't, we're dependent on these Russian engines, right? How else are we going to do whatever we need to do for the next couple of years without them?
If we didn't have them...
This is a national security issue here.
Right, it's a national security issue. And if we didn't have them at all, then we would rely on SpaceX to the extent that we could. We would have to shift to the much more expensive Delta alternative and pay whatever the cost is that we would have to pay. So it's theoretically possible, but without RD-180s at all, it's a lot of new complexity, and I don't see how we would have the competition, perhaps, that we have all hoped for and envisioned, because there would be no way Delta would ever be competitive with SpaceX.
I mentioned in my opening remarks about the capacities of the Russian Air Force and the Chinese. Certainly there's been a lot of aggressive behavior. In some cases we're deconflicting with them over Syria, and at times they appeared to have us sort of butt out. The Chinese have been doing some pretty remarkable things in the South China Seas. A lot of aspirations, a lot of their own capabilities. How are we matched against their, General Welsh or Madam Secretary, against some of their capacities?
Sir, right now, capacity-wise, let's start with the Chinese. They have about 325,000 people in the People's Liberation Army Air Force, which is a little bit, about the same size as we are, a little bit larger. But we have a couple thousand more aircraft today. The rate they're building, the models they're fielding, by 2030, they will have made up that 2,000 aircraft gap. And they will be at least as big, if not bigger, than our Air Force is in terms of aircraft. And they'll have to grow the people with it to operate them, so they'll be significantly larger in terms of people. They also, during that time frame, will field a number of new aircraft, a handful of new, completely new variants, and will have modified 3 of their older variants in that same time frame. And we are not keeping up with that kind of technology development. We are still in a position of we will have the best technology in the battle space, especially if we can continue with our current big 3 modernization programs with the LRSB and the F-35, but they will have a lot of technology that's better than the stuff we've had before. And so the Russians are doing the same thing in the nuclear business, not so much in the conventional force, but they're demonstrating capabilities that they haven't demonstrated to us before. Cruise missiles, some of their new aircraft are dropping weapons for the first time in conflict. We're able to watch and see how this is working. So they're serious air forces, and they're serious about getting better. And the Chinese in particular clearly have a blueprint that is matching against our shortfalls. And so I think that's something that we have to consider as we look to the future. Not modernizing our Air Force is not an answer that's acceptable.
Sometimes it's a sensitive subject, but the issues of rules of engagement. We had the Navy in here the other day, and the history of free passage and free navigation. We look at things that the Chinese are requiring of us today. How do you deal with that issue? I don't think it's just anecdotal. There are challenges that our airmen are facing that sometimes we don't hear about. What are the rules of engagement, and how would you characterize some of the instances we've read about, American people read about, in terms of the Chinese, shall we say, confronting our aircraft? The Russians, I assume, in other parts of the world have been, going across the East Coast, and at times obviously doing a variety of surveillance. How are we matching that?
So I'm assuming you're talking about the intercepts of aircraft and how they've been conducted. Yeah. There have been incidents where we thought the intercept and the conduct of the pilot after the intercept was not acceptable. It was certainly not within the bounds of normal behavior, but there haven't been that many of them, relatively speaking. And when there is one, it's highlighted. We actually do communicate with both the Russians and the Chinese and point out to them the behavior, and the behavior tends to adjust. For example, in East China Sea, we had an issue with aircraft from a particular unit that were intercepting some of our ISR platforms that were behaving aggressively. And after demarche following that, that behavior changed. So it isn't, when you read about it, it's really an isolated incident, in my view, compared to the majority of intercepts, which are relatively professionally accomplished. And that's true both with China and Russia. We also intercept their platforms when they fly either around Europe or they fly around the coast of the United States, and we have the same protocols we follow.
What about the issue of denial of airspace?
Well,
I know from time, we read from time to time of symbolic flights, but in reality, have we conceded anything?
No, sir. In the South China Sea, for example, as the commander of U.S. Pacific Command repeatedly states, we have not changed our patterns. We have freedom of navigation in that area. We still do overflight of that area. We've made it very clear that is not a Chinese restricted zone of any type, either on the sea or in the air.
Joint Strike Fighter, the ALICE system, can we talk a little bit about some of the issues that you've been focusing on to get that system right, and tell us why it's so important?
Please.
The two big issues that I believe exist between now and initial operational capability this fall, our window is August to December to declare that, and I'm pretty confident we're going to get there from here. The two issues have been development of the automated logistics information system. It has been a complicated process. It's been a difficult journey that the companies and the services have been on trying to get this to where it needs to be for the future. But I am actually relatively confident we'll get there for what we need to have at IOC. The biggest issue right now is getting engine data incorporated into ALICE because it comes from a different contractor. And the companies have been working together trying to make this happen. I'm expecting to have that data integrated in July, and that'll give us a month or so to look at how it operates, make sure it's working properly before we enter our IOC window. The other issue that Lockheed Martin in particular and their subcontractors are paying an awful lot of attention to is a software problem, and it has to do with radar stability. It's software stability, but it's really radar stability. And they have been working this extremely hard. They now have their software integration labs on 24/7, 7-day-a-week operations, doing multiple quicker iterations of software changes. They're fielding a recommended change to the software they think will fill this problem. They've done it in the labs in February. They're putting it into flying platforms in March, and we hope we'll be able to put it in the airplanes here shortly thereafter to make sure that it's working. So those are the two big things, sir, but I think we'll get there.
There's been some loose talk, and I think it's hopefully on the loose, that somehow some might bypass this this new system of systems here, and that's something I don't think would be advisable.
As far as bypassing the F-35?
No, not the F-35, but trying to get around this, what you tell me is going to be a good news story at some point in time.
Oh, yes, sir. No, we can't get around it.
We can't do that.
We got to run forehead first right through the middle of it. Yeah, this has got to work. The airplane's got to do what we were told it would do, and what the requirements demand that it does, clearly, and that's where we're going.
Further questions, members? Yes, Mr. Visklowski, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had a number of questions today and comments about space. What I'd like to do is talk about space strategy, because we've talked about launch, we've talked about defense. NRO uses space, NASA uses space, CIA uses space, Department of Defense uses space. Who's the principal contact and point to organize the United States of America government's space strategy?
Well, I'll begin, and Chief, please do jump in. So I'll say there's the principal defense space advisor, and that would be me. And I'm the principal one when it comes to looking across budgets and organizational constructs, and at least being a single voice to be able to advise our top leaders. And then there is Strategic Command, which is the operational warfighter. So this would be Admiral Haney, and under him, General Hyten would be the Air Force space component of Space Command. So these are the warfighters who are focusing on changing the culture, who are focused on what we call the JIC-SPOC, which for the first time, we're going to be sitting but we are sitting now side by side with the NRO, which are our top space partners, I'll say, figuring out ways that if things should go poorly on Earth, how do we defend the constellation? How do we war game that out, and so on. So that's kind of from the warfighter's perspective. I would say Admiral Haney's at the top of that, and then, of course, there's our General Hyten as the Air Force component commander.
How does that work between you and General Haney? And who makes the ultimate decision? I assume there's some consensus that's developed, plus the world changes every day. Is it essentially your office and Stratcom that coordinate all these agencies that have an interest in space?
So we work very closely together, and of course, I don't do anything without General Welsh as well. And ultimately, we're making our recommendations up to the Deputy, the Secretary of Defense, and even to the President. So that's the high-level attention that space receives these days. But we work very closely together, and there have not been, disputes about, him thinking one thing and me thinking another thing. We've worked very, very closely together.
Does Stratcom have a larger role to play? Is it about right? Because you have, again, civilian agencies that are involved here as well as military intelligence. Just want to make sure there's kind of that central point of contact, if you could.
Sir, I would look at it as the resource and policy decisions are led by, in the Department of Defense, are led by the Defense Space Council and the Secretary. To include resourcing decisions that are made, and that's done in coordination with the NRO, with the intelligence community, and with U.S. Strategic Command as an observer. Their intent is to meet the requirements of U.S. Strategic Command along with the requirements of those other organizations. For operational strategy in space, U.S. Strategic Command has the lead for the Department of Defense, and they do coordinate with NRO, with the intelligence community, and even with industry as partners who operate satellites in that domain. Mm-hmm. The big change has got to be going forward a more integrated approach to everything we do in that domain, because everything is going to have to be more resilient, not just military hardware in space. Commercial hardware is also is going to have to be more resilient, because it is also at risk from anything from debris to ASATs. And so one of the great things about General John Hyten is that he has a great big vision for space operations and integration. And he is really helping us kind of organize around this idea that it has got to be much more cooperative, but it has to look at this domain as a contested domain and potentially a warfighting domain. And that changes the level of cooperation we have to do on the operational concepts.
As far as that integration, are there any budgetary issues you face in 2017 that retard that?
We think we're adequately funded in FY17, so this goes to some of the additional investments that we have been making over time.
Okay. If I could ask about resources in another way, on the nuclear modernization plan, as I understand it, the request for 17 is $6.5 billion, which is about 195% more than the 16 budget. And I understand all that request is in the base, not OCO. Given, and again, there's been conversations today about the unpredictability going forward, do you have a level of confidence that that modernization program and those significant new dollars that are needed are going to be there, and where do they come from, assuming the shadows of the future remain unaltered here for a couple of years?
Well, there's no question that we, and I believe the other services, face a bow wave beyond our 5-year defense plan. So we all have an imperative to be ready, to have the right number of people, and to be modern. And somehow, under sequestration projections in particular, it's not all going to add up. So there's going to have to be decisions made as a United States of America. What kind of a military do we want to have? And if we want to be able to live with that lesser dollar figure, then there's going to have to be decisions on what has to be given up. I think we need it all. I think we need these nuclear modernization programs as well as the other modernization programs, as well as the people and the readiness. So I don't have a good suggestion for you on what to cut, because I think we need it all, and I hope that a future debate of the country would agree, given the threats that the chairman and you and others have talked about around the world.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim.
Mr. Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cyber plays a critical role in all aspects of national security. As the main service component for cyber funding, Your budget reflects shortfalls in cyber networks and the Defense Information Systems Network. In recent months, it has become evident that both China and Russia have shown the willingness to use their offensive cyber capabilities. Secretary James, we all understand the services are taking risks due to the current budgetary environment, but how can we justify taking a risk in an area that affects every aspect of our national defense?
Well, I want to begin by explaining that we do have about $4 billion in our budget for the totality of cyber. And so that includes the IT backbone, it includes our defense, and it also includes efforts to use cyber as a substitute for kinetic operations. So those are the three main components. We have been trying over time to focus more on the defense and on the substituting cyber for kinetic piece of the equation. And so that's where some of the risk has come into play for the IT backbone. With that said, our Undersecretary of the Air Force is leading an effort right now to look at ways that we can maybe leverage the private sector differently, to plug in more on the IT backbone to allow us to continue to shift the focus to defense and to the substitution on the kinetics part of it. I also want to say that we have been, I think, leaders in the Department of Defense on another element known as the Joint Information Environment, the Joint Information Network, and that also will mitigate our future cyber risks.
So you can sleep well at night on that theory.
I never sleep well at night, Congressman.
We need to talk more often.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, if I could add one thing, the boss mentioned $4 billion in 17. We have $20 billion across the FIDEP going into this pot. And we've also started a task force called Task Force Cybersecurity under the boss's direction, run by her CIO. And the intent of that task force is to identify the right places to target spending before we spend more. And so I think we're actually in a pretty good place on this. We have a lot of resources going into it, and we're trying not to throw money at the wrong thing before we know exactly what the right thing is.
Thank you, Ms. McCullum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too would like to reflect the sentiments of this committee of thanking you, Secretary James, not only for the outreach that your professional staff has had with our office, but your personal outreach to me as well. And General Walsh, thank you for your service, but having been in a family that was very much attached to the Air Force, to your wife, I know all the work that my mother put into making sure that our family was whole and functioned so that my father could be working on his job. I hope I have two questions that might free up some funding that you can put towards readiness and other programs. So Secretary James, I'd like to call your attention to a memo that was written last July by the Commander of the Air Force Space Command, General John Hyten, who entitled Commander's Intent for Ongoing Material Decisions. And the memo states that the Air Force should begin outsourcing some of the on-orbit operation and maintenance of its wideband global SATCOM communication satellites to commercial operators. And the intent would be to free up then more uniformed Air Force personnel currently devoted to these infrastructure maintenance and utilization, and they could put them towards other purposes and would also help lower costs in the Air Force. So I'd like you to respond to the global a system and what we could do to help the Air Force with discussions on industry and possibly commercializing more this system. And then the second question I have, Secretary James and General Walsh, has to do again with BRAC, because there's the Department of Defense, you proposed a new round of base realignments and closures in 2019, believing as much as 25% of the infrastructure might be in surplus. 25%, that's a quarter of surplus infrastructure. So what is your assessment of the extent of excess facilities in the Air Force? And could you describe to what extent these surplus facilities burden the Air Force and actually hold you down from doing the job you want to do in a cost-effective manner to stand ready to protect the United States?
So first on the issue of can we use the commercial companies more in our satellite communications realm? I think the answer is absolutely, and we're trying to move in that direction. I think our future will never be completely commercial. I think it'll be a mix, but I think over time we absolutely ought to and can get to more commercial participation in that. And indeed, right now we're running several pathfinders. Think of those as pilot programs where we're working with industry on some creative new efforts that could lead us down that path, such as trading hardware used for bandwidth elsewhere in our constellation. So we are working on this, and I think the future with commercial could help us save money. It could provide more flexibility. It could also give us more resiliency in our constellation. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Then when it comes to a BRAC, we very much need another round of base closures and realignment. I think our estimate at this point, because it's not a full-up analysis, but it's our best estimate, is more like 30% excess capacity, 30% excess capacity. And the impact of not having a base closure means we are having to maintain more structure than we think we need. And you heard me say I'm worried about infrastructure across the Air Force. We have an ever-shrinking pot of money for infrastructure improvement, and we're spreading it out way, way thin. And if we could reduce that overall footprint of infrastructure, we would have more money to keep up and improve the facilities that we really need going forward. So we very much do need a base closure going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for being a little late, but I'm glad I could be here for the hearing this morning. Thank you for being here, and we appreciate your testimony. I want to ask a little bit about the Delta 5 and Falcon 9. I understand there's talk, there's some discussion about the retiring of the current Atlas V rocket and using only the Falcon 9, the Delta Medium and the Delta Heavy. The current Atlas V launches 75% or more of our national security payloads and serves the NASA Commercial Crew Program. Meanwhile, Air Force is evaluating a new version of the Falcon 9. It seems prudent to keep the AR-1 engine on track for its promised production delivery date of late 2019 by not diluting the funding for it. The Mitchell Commission and other experts, they talk about the re-engine rocket is unusual. Discussed about the fact that being unusable. And in recent decades, re-engine rockets performed well. Even the current Atlas V is a re-engined rocket, and Orbital ATK is re-engineering the Antares rocket with a Russian RD-181. We need to see the first flight and the certificates for the new Falcon 9, the Falcon Heavy, and the upscale BE-4 engine, and the Vulcan rocket. The question being, are you willing to make it a priority for the ELV funding, to keep that funding there to keep AR-1 on track so that if we need it for the current Atlas V, we'll have it ready for the testing in 2020?
So we recently, like a couple of days ago, completed the final 2 awards out of 4 to invest in rocket propulsion systems. So one of those awards was to Aerojet Rocketdyne, and indeed they did get the most money of any of the other awardees. So more money, I'm sure, would be welcomed by the company, but in a full and open competition environment, and remember that is what the law told us to do, was to invest in rocket propulsion systems in a full and open way. Aerojet Rocketdyne did get a pretty good award just a few days ago. So we believe as the government that we're on track to develop an engine replacement for the Russian engine by 2019, but I caveat that's ambitious. The technical experts say it's very ambitious, but we're pulling out the stops to do it, as are the various companies who are participating. Beyond 2019 and the development of that engine, assuming all goes well, we still need to integrate it into a rocket, and it must be certified. And only until those three things are complete will it take us to space. So an engine alone, of course, will not take us to space. We need the total capability, and we think that'll be a bit beyond 2019.
As you, as the Air Force is the guarantor of access to space, the primary customer of ULA and the major customer of SpaceX, the Air Force has every right to conduct an independent study of the timeline of the AR-1, the BE-4, and any proposed SpaceX future certification, such as that of the Falcon Heavy. I think it's imperative that you conduct an independent study and review include all the development of the risk factors known to the industry. And my question to you would be, would you be willing to do that?
Well, as far as I know, but please allow me to go back and double check, we are sort of very much integrated and watching very closely the development in terms of how these projects are going. Now, the prime, in this case ULA, that's the manufacturer, obviously, who is got to select an engine to go forward. You know, there's two possibilities. They consider the BE-4 to be the front runner with the AR-1 to be the backup. That's their decision based on where they believe they are in the timelines. And we have people who are watching this very closely as well. So I believe we're already fulfilling that intent, but please allow me to go back and double check that.
Okay, if you could get back with us on that, I'd appreciate it. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ruppersberger?
Yes, you know, I think it's very positive that a lot of the questions here today are about space. Most people, most of the public don't really have a clue about what space was about. In the old days when we went to the moon, everybody knew space and who the astronauts were. So it's something that affects us every day, and it costs a lot of money. So the more that we can keep focused, the better. I think the issue of launch and ULA, probably ULA is the best, but the cost got out of control, and also the scheduling. And so that's why there's language in there now to deal with the issue of competition. If you look at the American way, the competition makes a difference. But on the other hand, and I think you know, Robert raised that, and you know, we have to make sure that when we have competition that we still have the best. And it's just not, you know, we can't afford to fail with the money and all the things that are involved. The one area that I would like to get into that I'm a little concerned about, again, getting back into space, is the need to ensure access to space with specific launch locations. And what do I mean by that? We're currently relying on Kennedy Space Center and Vandenberg Air Force Base launches in order to reach equatorial or polar orbits. Now, this reliance on these two locations marks them as single points of launch failure for these type of launches we've been talking about. And should there be a natural disaster, mechanical failure, or an attack on these facilities, yes, would not be able to put space assets into orbits. My question is, should we be developing secondary launch sites like Wallops Island or Kodiak, Alaska, to ensure access to space?
I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that one, and I'll have to come back to you for the
Well, that's why I
record
raised
if
the
I
issue,
might.
because it's out there, but
I'll give you an opinion on this,
Yeah.
and I think General Hyten would probably share this. As we look at this space enterprise and how we do it differently in the future, as we look more at disaggregation, microsats, CubeSats, small sats, things that don't have to go from a large launch complex all the time, I think proliferating launch complexes is probably going to be a natural outshoot of this. I think it's commercially viable. It may be a way for companies to get into the launch business who could not afford to get into it or don't see a future in it for large national security space launches. But I think this has got to be part of the strategy that this whole national team puts together as we look to the future. This is the kind of thing John Hyten is talking about. How do we change the game for the long term?
The other thing, you talk about competition, and you have SpaceX now and ULA, that's it. And SpaceX is in a limited area as far as their certification. Is that correct?
SpaceX is currently certified for 4 of the 8 launches.
4 of the 8, okay. Now, how are you doing with the other companies out there that have the possible capability as far as bringing them aboard?
There's one other company at the moment which has submitted a statement of interest to get certified, so that's a possible third. And so we continue to monitor and work with companies as they wish to possibly enter this market.
Is there an incentive for money-wise for those companies to move forward? or do you think we're just going to be here with these two now?
Well, the incentive that the companies tend to look at is they look at the totality of the market, of which, you know, our piece, the national security launches, is a piece of that market, but there is another market worldwide. And so that's what they tend to look at. They look at the totality of it. And as I said, we have two now that are certainly active participants. I mentioned earlier, I believe in competition too, and that's what the law says to do, but I worry that if you don't have two that truly are competitive from a cost competitive standpoint, you're not going to have much of a competition.
My final point is that I think one of the major issues with ULA, and we know the history why Boeing and Lockheed came together, we needed that as a country. However, I've been very concerned. I've been to the leadership in Alabama on numerous occasions, but the issue of the scheduling, where I've seen programs that were very effective now, they're up, it's classified, I can't talk about them, that had to wait 1.5 years for launch. I hope you're working with ULA or if SpaceX on the issue of scheduling. Our scheduling seems to be antiquated, and it seems that we might be able to do that better and quicker.
Okay, thank you. As far as I understood it, it was mostly on the government to determine when these things would launch. And of course, the government does it partly based on need, and it's partly budgeting. There's a variety of factors. I wasn't aware that the companies were a reason for the holdup, but. Mm-hmm. Well.
Thank you. The Air Force and other service have some immediate needs. They're often reflected in the OCO account, what we used to call the directed funding for the war on terror. You have some money in there, I think over $400 million for to procure some additional Reapers. What else do you have in there, and why are those type of investments important? I know there have been some issues relative to losses. I assume there's some reasons we've had these losses. What else is in there? Because we have a fight on our hands right now. We can look towards the Russians and Chinese long-range capabilities, but what are we doing, should we say, on the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups?
Yes,
your capabilities there.
One of the notable things that you have actually helped us with immensely, but we can always use more help in this arena, is buying munitions. You know, we have authority this year now to buy munitions on a forecast usage rate instead of dropping a bomb and then waiting 3 budget cycles before we actually get it replaced. What we've been doing for the last 15 years is rating our operational stocks that support major war plans in order to do the current day-to-day business with the weapons that we're expending in the Middle East. This ability to forecast expenditure for the next year and then put OCO money against buying against it before we drop the bombs is helping stabilize that, but it's not replacing the stockpiles. The stockpiles are still down. We need to think about that. It's a serious problem. And we're at a point where we have to have some kind of money other than OCO to get at it, because
we don't really focus on munitions, I mean, really.
No, sir. And we've got to go to the companies and say, you need to be able to increase your production capacity in some cases if we really want to refresh the stockpiles. To do that, it can't be OCO money. It's got to be money that has a tail on it. So anything we could do in that regard to free up money to use for munitions is going to be helpful for us every year.
I shared with you yesterday when you were kind enough to pay a courtesy call with me and with Peter, Ranking Member Visklosky, that you were complimentary of our investment, and you were this morning on ISR. And I have to say, as I said, General Breedlove has brought, you know, he is, the amount of ISR that's out there, not only relative to his command, Central and South America, Africa, these are areas that have immediate needs, I assume, right?
Chairman, they do. I would just add one caution. I mentioned it before. The way we got after the ISR shortfall starting in 2008 is we were told, buy as much as you can and fill it as fast as you can. That led to the problem we have in the RPA enterprise today, because we didn't keep up with the people. We bought the equipment and we kind of created the people as we went and took it from other places. If we want to increase the numbers in the RPA enterprise or the ISR enterprise, we have got to look to the future, plan on having money ahead of time, and build a plan that we can actually execute and have the people to actually implement and run the system. That may require a plus up and a top line of manpower for the Air Force, but we need to be able to look at it, the plan ahead of time, and show it to you. Otherwise, we're going to be in this thrash we've been in for the last 8 or 9 years in the ISR arena forever.
And what are you doing to assure everybody has a piece of the cyber, advocacy? Well, what are we doing to make sure that we are working jointly?
So
So those resources are not,
yes, sir.
we can have an accounting for them.
Sir, the boss mentioned the joint information environment. That is a joint single network for the department, intended to bring all of our services and OSD together on a single network for everybody from the warfighters to the folks back in the Pentagon. That is a multi-service contribution. Everybody's contributing both money, manpower, planning, and resources to make this thing happen. We are right with the rest of the pack, running as fast as we can to make that a reality. That will force us into joint in the information architecture arena. That's step one. We have some regional security stacks that go with that, which are the way the warfighters actually will connect into and out of this system. Those are also joint. They're being executed in the major commands, and they'll be done with air components included in the discussion with everybody else. So this is now a joint discussion. All the information systems we have, from the DCGS system that moves our intel data around, are all connected to everybody now. And so we've just got to make sure that we keep moving in that direction, and I think we're clearly on that path.
We like the connections. We hope all those links are well protected and hardened. Mr. Wiskoski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could get back to the nuclear modernization program, you have a long-range standoff weapon under development, not without controversy. But the point of the question is more that there are parallel efforts going on, both with the Department of Defense as well as NNSA. It's estimated that on the standoff weapon, the estimated cost could be up to $30 billion for 1,000 weapons. There would be an additional 8 to 10 at NNSA. When we talk about modernization, ICBMs come up, B-61s come up, the long-range standoff bomber comes up, the long-range weapons comes up. Given the strategy of our nation, and then obviously we have a fiscal impact on that strategy, how's that prioritization made? Is there a prioritization within these programs as far as modernization program?
I would begin, Mr. Wiskoski, by pointing out that these are not really new programs and new capabilities, I should say. These are capabilities that we've had, and of course now we are focusing on modernizing them in order to continue to deter adversaries and assure our allies. And the other point I wanted to make is that both of these, of course, relate to validated requirements that come from STRATCOM through the joint staff and eventually come to the services, in this case the Air Force, to fulfill. In the case of the LRSO, that's the follow-on missile to replace the aging nuclear ALCM, and it is designed to be the nuclear standoff capability with improved capability. And then the B-61, similarly, is the follow-on program for a different type of a weapon. So they're both needed, they're both validated requirements, and we need to modernize.
General, on an unclassified level, how would you characterize the health of your munitions inventory?
On the conventional side or the nuclear side, sir?
Conventional.
On the conventional side, the inventory is fantastic. The weapons are great, and they're getting better and better. The problem is capacity, it's volume. We have depleted our stocks over time. With the fight we've been in for the last 15 years, we have not been able to replenish them. We just didn't have as much money as we would like to have to put into munitions. We've been sharing a lot of them with allies in this effort, many of whom use precision weapons now alongside us, but don't produce their own. And so we just have stockpiles that have been depleted, and we need to replenish them if we want to really have war plans that we can actually go execute quickly in the event of some kind of major contingency. And that's where any help we can get on the munition side for funding is very, very helpful.
And is that reflected in the 17 request to an extent?
Yes, sir. We have increased the request for munitions funding in 17. We got help last year, and to include use of OCO funding to help to use in a different way to acquire munitions on forecast, as I mentioned before. But we still need to keep at this every year. This is one that's not going to go away in the short term because we have really depleted the stocks.
Well, one final question, if I could, Mr. Chairman. On the nuclear force, there have been problems in the past as far as morale, esprit de corps, issues have come up. And my sense under your watch is significant steps have been taken and improvements have occurred, under both of you, I really should say. Would you just want to comment on that as where you think you are in that process? And again, from a budgetary standpoint, is there anything you would be lacking in 17 to continue that push as far as that sense of, everybody has a very important responsibility here, and I do believe you both made very good progress here.
Right. Well, we have worked very hard on it. We have shifted dollars, we have shifted manpower, we have redone over time the way we train our nuclear forces. We're providing more professional development opportunities for the people who are engaged in this important mission. There's new financial incentives. So we really have focused a lot of attention on people, readiness, and modernization of the force. And I think it's very important that we keep the momentum going, that we keep double checking and seeing how we're doing. But I agree, I think we have made progress, very good progress.
Yeah, very good. Thank you both. Thank you, Chairman.
Hope.
Yeah, just got one quick question. Of course, as you know, NASA invests a lot of billions of dollars in hardware development for commercial space crew and cargo resupply, but the only intellectual property rights that we receive in the NASA commercial program is the right to buy the data rights to those items for the second time if the company goes out of business. Question being, what is the Air Force doing to ensure a better deal than we currently have? And more particular, what are you doing to ensure that the U.S. government maintains enough intellectual property production rights should the service providers fail to perform adequately within the respect to the cost, schedule, or future behavior?
So if I may come back to you with a complete answer, but give you the best answer I can give you right now, one of the reasons why when we had in front of us the last NDAA, which said invest in rocket propulsion systems, do it by 2019, full and open competition. One of the reasons why we chose the OTA, Other Transaction Authority approach, was because we could tailor it. It was flexible enough that we could work with different companies who have different pathways that they're looking to build to get us to space, and give us some access to data, like intellectual property data. It doesn't mean we own it, but it gives us access to that data such that we can convince ourselves that this will in fact be ultimately a reliable pathway for us. So because we do launch as a service, we don't own the components. That's why we don't have the direct intellectual property. But the key is to get access to the data, and that's one of the reasons why we selected this OTA approach. So that's the beginning, but if I may come back to you with a more complete.
Okay, well, just, I think the bottom line is trying to find a better, to make sure the taxpayer's dollar is protected, and I think that's the bottom line. So if you could follow up with me on that, that'd be appreciative.
I'd like to close on a positive note. The initials OCX, where do we stand? We've made substantial investments there. Yeah, maybe you want to call on Betty to
Yeah, I think we need Betty's opinion on this one. Yeah, OCX is still a very big challenge for our Air Force. It's a very important capability. This is the ground stations for our GPS, and it still is very much a troubled program. We were faced not long ago, when I say we, I mean we the Air Force and we OSD, with some serious questions to answer. How are we going to go forward? Were we going to go forward at all? What if we canceled? What if we did this? What if we did that? At the end of the day, we said we've got to have this capability, and we're going to have to keep with this approach a bit longer. But between Frank Kendall and me and our teams, we are going to provide like a lot more oversight. We're going to have, going forward, more off-ramps for the contractor. So that is to say, if you don't get this done by time certain, that's an off-ramp, and you may face cancellation even. So there's going to be a lot more of that going on because it is a capability that we really need for the future, but it is a troubled program.
Well, people are more likely to, if anything, to step up their jamming and their cyber attacks, and this is something which is pretty critical to all of us. Anything further? I want to thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here, General Welsh, and appreciate everybody's testimony. And I think we'll have some questions for the record, and we'd like to have those in due course. Again, good hearing. Thank you very much, and Godspeed to you. Thank you. Stand adjourned.
Chairman.